The plastic fork pushed the cafeteria noodles around aimlessly as Min Jae Park sat at the corner table, trying to make herself as small as possible. The lunchroom buzzed with typical high school energy, laughing, shouting, the clatter of trays. But to her, it all felt like a wall of noise separating her from everyone else. 3 months had passed since her family moved from their cozy apartment in Seoul to this bustling American town. Back home, lunch meant sharing kimchi and rice with her best friends, giggling over silly jokes, and planning weekend trips to the music store. Here, each lunch period stretched out like an eternity. A burst of laughter erupted from the table next to hers. Minji didn't need to look up to know they were laughing at her again. Earlier that day, she tried answering a question in physics class. Despite knowing the solution perfectly, her accent had twisted the words, making velocity sound more like velocity. The teacher had understood her, but some classmates had started mimicking her pronunciation before she even finished speaking. The memory made her cheeks burn. She pulled out her phone, pretending to be absorbed in something important. The screen reflected her face. Her mother's carefully styled hair, now slightly messy. The cheerful yellow sweater she'd chosen that morning, now feeling too bright, too noticeable. Minji's fingers unconsciously moved across her phone screen, tracing the patterns of a violin piece she'd been practicing before leaving Korea. Music had always been her sanctuary. Ever since her grandmother first placed a tiny violin in her 4-year-old hands, she'd found peace in its strings. The instrument became her voice when words failed, her comfort when the world felt too big. Now her beloved violin sat at home, carefully stored in its case. She hadn't touched it since arriving in America. Somehow, playing alone in her new bedroom felt different from practicing in her grandmother's warm studio, surrounded by the smell of barley tea and the gentle corrections of the woman who taught her everything she knew about music. A half-eaten sandwich sailed over her head, landing with a soft plop on the floor behind her. More laughter. Minji's hands tightened around her phone, but she kept her face carefully blank. Her mother's words from that morning echoed in her mind. Stay strong, little bird. Sometimes, the world tests us so we can learn to sing louder. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Minjae gathered her barely touched food, disposing of it quickly. As she walked toward her next class, she heard whispers following her. Did you hear her in physics? So weird. Why doesn't she just learn to talk normally? Each step down the hallway felt heavier than the last. She clutched her textbooks closer to her chest, using them as a shield. The confident girl who had once performed violin solos in front of hundreds in Seoul now struggled to even make eye contact with her classmates. Passing by the school's music room, Minji paused for just a moment. Through the small window in the door, she glimpsed an old upright piano, sheet music scattered across its top. Something tugged at her heart. A familiar longing for the comfort of music, for the way her violin could express everything she couldn't say in words. But the warning bell rang, startling her back to reality. Minji hurried to her next class, slipping into her seat just as the final bell sounded. As she opened her notebook, her fingers again found their familiar position, silently playing an invisible violin. Maybe her mother was right about learning to sing louder. Maybe she just hadn't found the right song yet. The hallway echoed with cruel laughter as Minji rushed past a group of students who had just mocked her presentation in English class. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let tears fall. Not here. Not where they could see. She just needed to find somewhere quiet, somewhere to breathe. Without thinking, her feet carried her down an unfamiliar corridor. The sounds of the busy lunch period grew fainter as she walked, until she found herself in a quiet wing of the school she'd never explored before. A slightly ajar door caught her attention. The music room she'd only glimpsed through the window before. Minji hesitated, then gently pushed the door open. The room smelled of wood and paper, reminding her instantly of her grandmother's studio. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, dancing across the dusty keys of an old upright piano. Sheet music lay scattered about, and instrument cases were carefully arranged along one wall. The chaos felt oddly comforting, like walking into a familiar embrace. Her hand brushed against the piano keys, producing a soft, unexpected chord. The sound hung in the air, and something inside her chest loosened. Before she knew it, she was sitting at the piano bench, her fingers finding their place on the keys as naturally as breathing. She started playing softly at first, a simple Korean lullaby her grandmother had taught her when she was very young. The melody felt like a friend she hadn't seen in too long. As her confidence grew, her fingers moved more freely, adding harmonies her grandmother had shown her over cups of barley tea. Memories flooded back, weekend mornings filled with music, her grandmother's gentle corrections, the way they would take turns on violin and piano, creating duets that filled their small apartment with joy. Min-jae hadn't realized how much she'd been holding inside until she felt it flowing out through the music. She switched to violin pieces she knew by heart, playing them on the piano, translating one instrument's voice to another. The music grew stronger, more confident. In this empty room, she didn't have to worry about her accent or finding the right English words. The notes spoke perfectly for her. Time seemed to stop. The lunch period bell rang somewhere in the distance, but Min-jae barely heard it. She was lost in the music, in memories, in the feeling of finally being able to breathe freely for the first time since coming to America. A soft creak from the doorway startled her. Min-jae's hands froze on the keys as she spun around, expecting to find someone ready to mock her or tell her to leave. Instead, she saw an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, leaning on a walking cane. "Please," he said quietly, "don't stop on my account." That was beautiful. Min-jae's heart pounded as she recognized him as Mr. Chen, the music teacher she'd seen in the hallways but had been too shy to speak to. She started to gather her things, mumbling an apology for using the piano without permission. "Wait," he said, moving into the room with unhurried steps. That last piece was that Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. When Min-jae nodded, his face lit up. "But you gave it something extra. Those harmonies weren't in the original score, were they?" "No," Min-jae said softly. "My grandmother. She taught me to add Korean elements to classical pieces. She said music is like a conversation between cultures." Mr. Chen's smile grew wider. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." He gestured to the piano. "Would you mind playing it again? The room has been too quiet lately." Min-jae's fingers returned to the keys, hesitant at first, but as the melody began to flow, she felt the tension in her shoulders release. The music room wasn't just an escape anymore. It felt like she discovered a piece of home in this foreign place, a space where she could be fully herself without fear of judgment. The following week, Min-jae brought her violin to school, tucked safely in its case. She'd gotten permission from Mr. Chen to practice in the music room during lunch, and somehow knowing she had this safe space made each morning a little easier to face. That day, she decided to play Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, a piece she performed at her last recital in Seoul. As she lifted the violin to her shoulder, muscle memory took over. The familiar weight of the instrument felt like reuniting with an old friend. The first notes soared through the room, clear and strong. Min-jae closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away. This was the piece that had won her first competition back home, the one her grandmother had spent countless hours helping her perfect. In this moment, the empty music room disappeared, and she was back in her grandmother's studio, surrounded by the scent of tea and the warm afternoon sun. She reached the most challenging part of the piece, a passage that had once made her fingers stumble. But today, they flew across the strings with confidence. Each note rang true, filled with emotion she couldn't express in words. The music spoke of homesickness and hope, of feeling lost and finding your way again. So absorbed was she in the music that she didn't notice Mr. Chen standing in the doorway until the final note faded away. He wasn't alone. Next to him stood a tall woman with reading glasses perched on her nose. Ms. Lee, the school principal. "I told you," Mr. Chen said softly to the principal. "She has something special." Min Jai lowered her violin, her cheeks flushing. She hadn't played for anyone except Mr. Chen since coming to America. "That was extraordinary," Ms. Lee said, stepping into the room. "Mr. Chen tells me you've been practicing here during lunch." Min Jai nodded, wondering if she was in trouble. "How long have you been playing?" Ms. Lee asked, genuine interest in her voice. "Since I was 4, Min Jai replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother taught me before I started formal lessons." Mr. Chen moved to the piano, shuffling through some papers. "The spring concert is in 6 weeks," he said, pulling out a program draft. "Our planned violin soloist, Tom, just informed me he can't perform. His family is moving to another state next month." Ms. Lee's eyes lit up. "Would you be interested in taking his place?" she asked Min Jai. The question hung in the air. Min Jai's heart raced. Perform? In front of the whole school. The same students who laughed at her accent and whispered behind her back. "You don't have to decide right away," Mr. Chen added gently. "But I've been teaching here for 30 years, and I've rarely heard someone play with such feeling." Min Jai's fingers tightened around her violin's neck. She thought about all the times she'd stayed silent in class, swallowing her answers because she was afraid of being mocked. She thought about her mother's words about learning to sing louder. "What piece will I play?" she asked quietly. Mr. Chen smiled. "That's the best part. You can choose. The spring concert is about showcasing student talent. It's your chance to share your music with everyone." Min Jai looked down at her violin, its wood gleaming in the afternoon light. In her mind, she heard her grandmother's voice. "Music speaks when words fail. It's the universal language of the heart." I think I'd like to try," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Ms. Lee beamed. "Wonderful. I'll add your name to the program right away." After they left, Min Jai remained in the music room, her mind spinning with possibilities. For the first time since coming to America, she felt a spark of excitement about something at school. She had 6 weeks to prepare, 6 weeks to find the perfect piece, 6 weeks to gather her courage. She lifted her violin once more and began to play, experimenting with different melodies. Maybe this was her chance to show everyone who she really was, not through words that could be mocked, but through music that could touch their hearts. News spread through the school like wildfire. Min Jai first noticed the change during morning classes. More whispers than usual, more eyes following her in the hallways. Someone had posted about the spring concert lineup on social media, and her name stood out among the familiar faces. "Did you hear? The quiet Korean girl is performing at the concert." "No way. Can she even play? This is going to be hilarious." The comments stung, but Min Jai kept her head high as she walked to her locker. Inside, she taped a small photo of her grandmother next to her sheet music. The sight of it usually gave her strength, but today something was wrong. Her heart dropped. The sheet music was gone. She searched frantically through her books, hoping it had slipped between pages. Nothing. This wasn't just any sheet music. It contained her grandmother's handwritten notes, precious guidance she'd relied on since leaving Seoul. During lunch, instead of heading to the music room, Min Jai found herself searching classroom recycling bins. As she dug through crumpled papers, she heard giggles from the hallway. A group of students quickly walked away when she looked up. In chemistry class, her lab partner, who usually ignored her, suddenly had questions. "So, what are you going to play? Mary had a little lamb?" The question was followed by poorly hidden snickers from nearby tables. Min Jai focused on her experiment, pretending not to hear. By the end of the day, her phone buzzed with notifications. Someone had created a meme using her yearbook photo, adding musical notes drawn all wrong and a caption mocking her accent. It had already been shared dozens of times in the school's social groups. Minji sat on her bed that evening, clutching her violin but unable to play. The weight of what she'd agreed to do felt overwhelming. She hadn't told her parents about the concert yet. They were so busy getting settled in their new jobs, working late hours to build a better life here. Her mother would worry, and her father might insist she withdraw to avoid potential embarrassment. A gentle knock on her door startled her. Her mother entered, holding a steaming cup of barley tea, just like grandmother used to make. "You seem troubled, little bird," she said in Korean, sitting beside Minji. "Your violin is quiet today." The familiar smell of the tea woke something inside Minji. Everything spilled out: the missing sheet music, the memes, the whispered mockery. Her mother listened silently, running gentle fingers through her hair like she used to do when Minji was small. "You know," her mother said finally, "your grandmother faced similar challenges when she first started teaching music. Some people said a woman shouldn't be a music teacher, that she should stay home instead. But she played anyway." Minji looked up in surprise. She'd never heard this story before. "She told me once that music is like water. It finds its way through any obstacle. The harder people tried to silence her, the more beautifully she played." The next morning, Minji arrived at school early and went straight to the music room. Mr. Chen was already there, organizing sheet music. "I was thinking about withdrawing from the concert," she admitted quietly. Mr. Chen set down his papers. "Before you decide, let me show you something." He pulled out an old photograph from his desk drawer. It showed a much younger version of himself standing next to a famous Chinese violinist. When he first came to America, people laughed at his accent too. They said he'd never succeed here. Mr. Chen smiled. "Last year, he played at Carnegie Hall." Music has a way of silencing the doubters, but only if we have the courage to play. Minji touched her violin case, feeling the strength of generations of musicians who had faced down fear and prejudice with nothing but their love of music. "I need to rewrite my sheet music," she said finally. "The original was taken, but maybe I can make it even better this time." Mr. Chen's eyes crinkled with pride. "That's the spirit. And Minji? Those who try to tear you down. They do it because they've never had the courage to create something beautiful themselves." The morning sun peeped through the music room's dusty windows as Minji's violin sang the opening notes of her chosen piece. Her fingers danced across the strings, weaving together the tender melody of Ererang, a beloved Korean folk song, with classical techniques she'd perfected over years of practice. The empty room filled with sounds that reminded her of her grandmother's garden in Seoul, of wind chimes tinkling in the spring breeze. But something wasn't quite right. She stopped, adjusted her posture, and started again. Mr. Chen watched from his usual spot by the piano, his experienced ears catching every subtle variation. "Remember," he said gently, "music is like telling a story. Your story. Let people feel what you felt when you first heard this song." Minji nodded, understanding flowing through her like the melody itself. She'd chosen this piece carefully, spending hours arranging it herself. The traditional Korean melody would start soft and haunting, then build into something bigger, incorporating elements of classical violin techniques she'd learned since childhood. It was a bridge between her past and present, just like she was. Every lunch break became a practice session. While other students chatted in the cafeteria, Minji worked tirelessly, repeating passages until her fingers ached. Mr. Chen brought her recordings of famous fusion performances, showing her how other musicians had successfully blended different musical traditions. One afternoon, as she practiced the most challenging part of her arrangement, a small group of younger students gathered outside the music room window. Instead of the usual teasing, they watched in genuine curiosity. One of them even gave her a thumbs up when she finished. It was a tiny moment, but it made her heart soar. The work wasn't just about the music. Minji spent evenings at home practicing her stage presence in front of her bedroom mirror. Her mother helped her design a special outfit, a modern take on a hanbok that would allow her to move freely while playing. They adapted her grandmother's old dress, keeping the traditional silhouette but shortening the sleeves and using lighter fabric that sparkled subtly under stage lights. As the concert date drew closer, Mr. Chen shared something unexpected. "I have a friend," he said during one practice session, "who plays violin for the city symphony. I sent her a video of you practicing." Minji's eyes widened with surprise. "She's very interested in your arrangement. Would you mind if she came to the concert?" Minji felt her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. A professional violinist? Coming to hear her play? She nearly dropped her bow, but managed to nod yes. The final week of preparation was intense. Minji arrived at school an hour early each morning to practice. She played until her shoulders ached and her fingers felt raw, then played some more. Mr. Chen brought her tea with honey for her nerves and shared stories about his own first performances. During her last practice session, something magical happened. As she played through the piece one final time, she forgot about the upcoming performance, forgot about the professional violinist who would be watching, forgot about all the students who had mocked her accent. The music flowed through her like a gentle stream, carrying away her fears. In that moment, she wasn't just playing the song. She was telling her story, sharing pieces of her heart through each note. That evening, as she carefully packed up her violin, Mr. Chen smiled warmly. "You're ready," he said simply. Minji returned his smile, feeling a calm confidence she hadn't expected. Tomorrow would be the concert, but tonight, in the quiet of the music room, she had already achieved something remarkable. She had found her voice, and it was more powerful than any words could express. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement on concert night. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, Minji peeked through a small gap, her heart pounding at the sight of the packed seats. Her mother had helped her into her modified hanbok, the silk gleaming under the stage lights. The traditional Korean dress had been carefully altered to allow freedom of movement while playing, its subtle sparkles catching the light with every breath. Backstage was organized chaos. Other performers practiced last-minute scales or whispered encouragement to each other. Minji stood alone in a quiet corner, her violin case open before her. She lifted out her instrument with trembling hands, remembering how her grandmother had taught her to check the strings before every performance. Mr. Chen appeared beside her, carrying a cup of warm tea with honey. "Your grandmother's pre-performance ritual," he said with a gentle smile. "She told me about it when I called her yesterday." Minji's eyes widened. "You spoke to my grandmother?" He nodded. "She wanted me to tell you she'll be watching the video recording tomorrow morning in Seoul. She said to remember what she always told you before competitions." Tears pricked at Minji's eyes as she whispered her grandmother's words. "Play from your heart, and your music will find its way to other hearts." The current act finished, and applause filtered through the curtain. Minji was next. Her legs felt like jelly as she walked toward the stage entrance. Just before she stepped out, she caught a glimpse of her mother and father in the front row, and beside them, an elegant woman she didn't recognize, the professional violinist Mr. Chen had invited. The stage lights were blinding as she walked to the center mark. The silence in the auditorium felt heavy, expectant. She could sense hundreds of eyes on her, could almost hear the unspoken judgments. Her modified hanbok rustled softly as she lifted her violin to her shoulder. In that moment, time seemed to stop. She thought of her grandmother's studio in Seoul, of the countless hours spent practicing, of the joy they'd shared in creating music together. She thought of Mr. Chen's quiet encouragement and her mother's unwavering support. She thought of all the lunches spent alone in the music room, finding comfort in melodies when words failed her. Minji took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of her arranged piece filled the auditorium, the familiar Korean melody of Arirang singing clear and true. She started softly, letting the traditional tune tell its story of longing and hope. Then, gradually, she began weaving in classical elements, building a bridge between two worlds through music. As the piece progressed, she forgot about the audience, forgot about the bullying, forgot about everything except the story she was telling through her violin. Her fingers flew across the strings with confidence born of countless hours of practice. The melodies soared and dipped, speaking of homesickness and courage, of loneliness and determination, of finding one's voice in a strange land. In the final section, where she had arranged the most challenging variations, Minji poured all of her experiences into the music. Every lonely lunch period, every mocking laugh, every moment of doubt, transformed through her violin into something beautiful and powerful. The last note hung in the air like a wish. For a moment, complete silence filled the auditorium. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. The applause spread like a wave, growing stronger and stronger until it became a thunderous standing ovation. Through the stage lights, Minji could see her parents standing, tears streaming down their faces. The professional violinist was on her feet, applauding with genuine admiration. But what touched Minji's heart most were the faces of her classmates, the same ones who had mocked her accent and stolen her sheet music. They sat there, some with mouths open in surprise, others wiping away unexpected tears. In that moment, they weren't seeing the weird Korean girl anymore. They were seeing Min-ji Park, musician and storyteller, someone who had found a way to speak directly to their hearts without saying a single word. The Monday after the spring concert felt different. As Minji walked through the school gates, she noticed the usual morning chatter pause briefly. But instead of mocking whispers, she heard something new. Respect in their voices, curiosity in their glances. A group of students from the school band approached her before first period. "Your arrangement was amazing," one of them said, clutching her flute case. "Would you consider teaching us how to blend traditional and classical music like that?" Before Minji could answer, Ms. Lee appeared with the professional violinist from the concert, Miss Park, beside her. "Minji, do you have a moment?" the principal asked, her eyes bright with excitement. In Ms. Lee's office, Ms. Park spoke warmly about Minji's performance. "I've rarely heard such an innovative arrangement," she said. "The way you bridged Korean and Western musical traditions was remarkable. I'd like to offer you a place in our summer mentorship program at the City Symphony." Minji's hands trembled in her lap as Miss Park explained the opportunity. Weekly private lessons, chances to perform with other young musicians, and guidance in developing her unique style. It was the kind of opportunity she dreamed about but never thought possible in her new country. During lunch that day, Minji headed to her usual sanctuary in the music room. But when she opened the door, she found it wasn't empty. 3 students sat there, one with a guitar, another with a trumpet, and a third at the piano. They looked up nervously when she entered. "Sorry," the girl at the piano said quickly. "We heard you practicing here sometimes. We thought, maybe we could play together. If that's okay." Minji felt a warmth spread through her chest as she took out her violin. They spent that lunch period learning from each other, sharing pieces of their musical backgrounds. The guitarist taught them a Spanish melody his grandfather had taught him, while the trumpet player shared a jazz piece she was learning. Word spread, and soon the music room became a gathering place during lunch. Students who had never spoken to each other found common ground in music. Minji began teaching simple Korean folk songs, while others shared music from their own cultures. The room that had once been her lonely refuge transformed into a space of creativity and connection. Even her academic life changed. In physics class, where she'd once been mocked for her accent, a girl raised her hand during a lesson about sound waves. "Could Minji explain this?" she asked the teacher. "She probably understands it really well because of music." Minji explained the concept, relating frequency and amplitude to musical notes and volume. This time, when her accent shaped some words differently, no one laughed. Instead, they listened, asked questions, and thanked her for making the lesson clear. After school one day, Mr. Chen found Minji helping a younger student with violin fingering. He watched from the doorway, smiling. "You've started quite a movement here," he said, gesturing to the busy music room. "Your grandmother would be proud." Minji thought about her latest video call with her grandmother, how her eyes had filled with tears watching the concert recording. "Music is like water," her grandmother had said, echoing her mother's words. "It finds its way through any obstacle, and where it flows, things grow." Looking around the room at her new friends, some practicing instruments, others doing homework together, all sharing the space with respect and curiosity, Minji understood what her grandmother meant. Her music hadn't just silenced the jeers. It had created something new and beautiful in their place. That evening, as she walked home with her violin case swinging gently by her side, Minji felt truly at home for the first time since moving to America. The summer ahead held exciting possibilities with the symphony mentorship, and the next school year would bring new chances to grow and share her music. But more than that, she'd have found her voice not just in music, but in life. She had learned that some things don't need translation: the language of kindness, the power of perseverance, and most importantly, the way music can bridge any distance, heal any wound, and bring people together in harmony.